Hey everybody, this is today's podcast, and it's on the European theater of World War II. I've got a big map of that up on my screen, which I'll send to you all. So I want to talk about the Anglo-American alliance, and it was not as seamless as memory would have it. I talked about this yesterday. There was actually quite a bit of disagreement between the United States and Great Britain about how to fight the war. As I said yesterday, a lot of this had to do with the memories of World War I, in the sense that Churchill and his general staff was really afraid that the war would devolve into trench warfare with the cross-channel invasion. This was their greatest fear. On the U.S. side, the great lesson of World War I was the necessity for a unified command, which I talked about a little bit yesterday, that there should be one overall commander over all the armies, although they were armies of different nationalities. The United States, Great Britain, Canada, Poland, France, of course. And the big point, I guess, before I start, is that the U.S. wins all the battles. The U.S. wins all these fights, and Great Britain loses. The other thing I should stress is also Churchill was a colonialist, and he really wanted to hang on to India and other British colonies. The French wanted to hang on to Vietnam and Algeria, and the U.S. had no interest in keeping these colonies alive. So there was a lot more tension, I guess you would say, in the Allied camp than historical memory would have it. Folks weren't just sitting around a campfire singing Kumbaya. There was some really intense fighting. And the other thing is the British military kind of despised the U.S. military. But overlaying this was the fact that the U.S. was the major power of World War II. This was very hard for the British military to accept. So there's a lot of factors here. Okay, so as you might remember, Churchill was very happy when Pearl Harbor was bombed. He immediately worked to establish a tight relationship with FDR. If you've ever been in the War Museum in London, you should go. It's pretty cool. There's this room, and it's kind of a famous story. It's also in that movie, Their Finest Hour, or I think that was the movie, where it looked like it was a bathroom where Churchill, the underground area where Churchill and his staff were. It's really amazing. It's a huge underground area. It actually wasn't that underground, by the way. If the Germans if there'd been a direct hit, it would have killed folks. It was just not that deep. But anyway, yeah, they didn't, thank God. So there's this, what looked like a bathroom, and that's where the phone was that Churchill used to talk to Roosevelt. And the reason they put it there was they didn't want anybody standing around and maybe hearing their conversations. And knowing Churchill was kind of a difficult guy. And if he went into that room, nobody would be hanging around the room because they didn't want to see him walk out at what they thought was the bathroom and have them yell at them. So just these kind of funny little details of history, which I actually think are really fascinating. So Churchill, he and Roosevelt had a relationship. Churchill said that he remembered when Roosevelt had been the Assistant Secretary of the Navy during World War I, which was probably not true. Churchill was much higher in the British government than Roosevelt was in the U.S. government. But he was trying to flatter Roosevelt. And Roosevelt respected Churchill. The other thing is that Roosevelt, and I've said this a lot, but it bears repeating, he was much more focused on Europe than he was on Asia. Of course, he thought Asia was important, but I don't think Roosevelt ever really doubted for a second that the Japanese would be defeated. It was just a question of how. It wasn't a question of when. Where he saw Hitler as a much greater threat, So he, even before the war, he had done everything to assist the British. He created this Lend-Lease program where the U.S. starts supplying Great Britain with a number of military goods. By the end of the war, the U.S. has supplied Great Britain with hundreds of billions of dollars in terms of military goods. Something I've talked a lot about, one of the key features of World War II is the incredible industrial capacity of the United States. It's one of those things that's so obvious, it's kind of like the sun rises in the east and sets in the west, so it kind of doesn't seem that important and it fades into the background. It should be in the foreground. The U.S. industrial production changed everything. It helped win the war, but think how it changed U.S. society. Full employment, what did it mean for African Americans, for the Mexican Americans that we've talked about? Major factor, maybe the most important major factor besides the courage of our fighting men and the Allied victory during World War II. So Roosevelt and Churchill, in sum, got along very easily. They had met in August of 1941, even before Pearl Harbor, and Churchill was very happy because even before that meeting, Roosevelt telegraphed, or he announced, that the strategy of the United States in World War II would be Europe first, which was, it seems in retrospect, of course, Europe would be first. It would be the first priority. But at the time, think about it now, Japan hasn't bombed Pearl Harbor yet, but the Germans never bombed Pearl Harbor. I mean, in some ways, there's not a obviously logical reason why Europe should be first, but I think it just shows the greatness of Roosevelt's leadership. He saw Hitler as the greater threat, and I think he was clearly right. Let's just think for a while. For instance, if Hitler had stayed in power another year, could he have developed atomic weapons if he'd stayed in power until 1946? One of the things that you should know by now, Hitler had no stop button, and if he'd had atomic weapons, I mean, God forbid. So anyway, so Churchill's very happy that Roosevelt announces this Europe first, and he sticks to it throughout the war. So the idea was that Roosevelt and Churchill would meet, and they had a meeting in August 1941, but the big meeting, really the important meeting, came after Pearl Harbor. It came around Christmas time, 1941, after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Churchill came to Washington. He was met by Roosevelt's top aide, Harry Hopkins, and amazingly, Churchill was invited to stay at the White House. And Churchill happily accepted, because there's nothing like proximity to power, right? That's really kind of what it's all about. And the U.S. Army was very unhappy about this arrangement. George Marshall, who was the American Army Chief of Staff, really, truly a great man, he feared that Churchill might fill Roosevelt with crazy ideas that were in the interest of the British rather than focusing on the German. And the other thing is, Churchill brought his portable war room with him, and he set it up in the White House, and the British officers could kind of wander around the White House freely, which wasn't true of American officers. So the U.S. Army wasn't really happy about this situation. During this period of time, Churchill gave a talk to Congress, which went very well. And by the time, by Christmas 1941, it was very clear that the leadership in Washington was focused on defeating Hitler, while at the same time realizing that the Japanese have to be defeated as well. So they struck a balance, but there was always a little bit more of a focus on Europe defeating Hitler, while at the same time building the aircraft carrier fleet, which ultimately would be what destroyed the Japanese. So Roosevelt gives this speech, and he says, this is a direct quote from Roosevelt, "What sort of people does the Axis power think we are? Is it possible they do not realize we shall never cease to persevere against them, and they have been taught a lesson which they in the world will never forget? So, a classic Churchill defiant language in front of Congress, and it was very, very effective. Churchill won over Roosevelt, and he also won over the U.S. Congress.